The first night I saw him, the hallway light flickered like it couldn't decide whether to reveal him or hide him. He smiled, polite and calm, the perfect neighbor. But every night after that, I'd hear his door open at exactly 3 a.m., and I started wondering why. I remember the first night I saw him because the hallway light was flickering, and it made the whole place feel like a low-budget mystery film. I had just moved into the building that afternoon, a squat, 4-story complex on the edge of downtown that looked nicer online than it did in person. The rent was cheap, though, and the place was close enough to work that I could walk if my car ever decided to die on me again. My new neighbor lived across the hall, apartment 3B. I was 3A. He introduced himself right away, almost like he'd been waiting for me to show up. His name was Evan, mid-30s, neatly dressed, calm voice. He offered to help me carry boxes, which I appreciated even though I insisted I had it covered. There was something practiced about his politeness, the kind you don't see much anymore. The first week was uneventful. I spent most evenings unpacking and figuring out which outlets actually worked. I could hear faint noises from Evan's apartment sometimes, the hum of music, maybe a TV documentary, but never anything louder than conversation level. He seemed like the ideal neighbor, quiet, organized, and not the kind to throw parties or borrow tools indefinitely. What caught my attention first wasn't noise but timing. Every night, without fail, I'd hear his door click open at around 3 in the morning. At first, I assumed he worked an odd shift, maybe a security guard or EMT. But he didn't look tired during the day, and he was usually home in the evenings when I got back. Sometimes I'd hear his footsteps cross the hall again just before sunrise. Always the same pattern. Always that exact hour. I didn't think much of it until one night when I couldn't sleep. The building creaked with that old structure rhythm that never quite lets you rest easy. Around 3:04, I heard his door open. Out of curiosity more than concern, I peered through my peephole. He was there, dressed neatly in dark clothes, locking his door with deliberate slowness. In one hand, he carried a small black duffel bag. He paused for a second, almost as if sensing he was being watched, then walked down the hall and disappeared toward the stairwell. The next morning, when I ran into him by the mailboxes, he looked as fresh as ever, coffee in one hand, a newspaper tucked under the other. I mentioned I had trouble sleeping and noticed how quiet the building was at night. He smiled politely, nodded, and said something about making use of the quiet hours. I laughed awkwardly, pretending to understand. Days passed, and I told myself not to overthink it. People have strange routines, I figured. Maybe he jogged at night. Maybe he was into astronomy. The city had all kinds of people. Still, the image of him walking out at that exact time kept replaying in my head. It wasn't fear, not yet, just a lingering curiosity that made me leave my living room lamp on longer than usual. There was something methodical about him, like his life ran on a schedule down to the minute. When you live in an old building, you get used to sounds, pipes expanding, neighbors moving around, the occasional argument 2 floors down. But there was something different about the way his door closed each night. It was always careful, controlled, like he didn't want anyone to hear him leaving. I started noticing the small details after that. His shoes were always spotless, even on rainy days. He carried a leather notebook everywhere, though I never saw him write in it. And his apartment always smelled faintly like metal and soap whenever he opened his door, a clean but sharp scent that didn't quite match his otherwise quiet presence. I told myself I was imagining things, that moving to a new place can make anyone overly observant. Still, every night, when the clock neared 3, I'd catch myself listening for that door. And every night, right on schedule, it would open. By the end of my second week there, the sound had become a part of my nights, like the ticking of a clock I didn't own. I didn't know what he was doing, or why, but I was sure of one thing: whatever routine he kept, it wasn't casual. And I couldn't shake the feeling that sooner or later, I was going to find out what it was. It started with a smell. Not an overwhelming one, just faint, metallic, and oddly specific, like a mix of wet pennies and machine oil. The first time I noticed it, I was coming home from work on a Tuesday evening. Evan's door was slightly ajar, probably because he was carrying groceries inside. The smell drifted out into the hallway, sharp enough to make me pause. By the time he noticed me and gave a polite nod, the door had already closed, and the scent vanished like a passing thought. At first, I brushed it off. Maybe he was fixing something, a hobbyist tinkering with tools or engines. But over the next few nights, that smell came back. Always subtle, always gone by morning. And it wasn't just that. There were the packages too. They started arriving late, sometimes close to midnight. I'd hear the elevator groan open and the muffled voices of delivery guys, confused to be dropping off boxes at that hour. The packages were never large, but they came frequently, narrow tubes, flat envelopes, small rectangular boxes with foreign shipping labels. I never saw Evan carry them out to the dumpster or recycling bins. It was like they disappeared into his apartment and never came back out. The noises came next. Not loud enough to complain about, but just enough to make me listen closer. Soft mechanical clicks, occasional scraping sounds, the faint hum of something running, not quite a fan, not quite a motor. Sometimes, it sounded like typing. Slow, deliberate, like someone pressing each key with care. I began to build small theories in my head, the way people do when their minds have too much empty space to fill. Maybe he was a night worker doing remote data entry. Maybe he was restoring typewriters or making models. Each guess was logical enough until it wasn't. The combination of metallic smells, late packages, and that 3 a.m. schedule didn't fit into anything that made complete sense. Curiosity slowly started edging into unease. One night, when I took the trash out, I caught sight of him in the alley behind the building. It was around 2:30 in the morning, and the streetlight barely worked, casting everything in uneven patches of orange. Evan stood near the dumpster, gloved hands moving through a small stack of papers. He looked like he was checking them for something, holding them up to the light, then tearing some to shreds before dropping them into a black bag. I tried to step quietly, but a loose piece of gravel betrayed me. He turned his head just enough for our eyes to almost meet. I pretended to check my phone, mumbled something about insomnia, and went back inside. The next morning, the alley was spotless. Not a single piece of torn paper remained. From that point on, I couldn't help but notice how self-contained his world was. He never had visitors. His windows were always covered, blinds drawn tightly even during the day. His mail pile was small, too small for someone living a normal life. He didn't even seem to own a car. I caught myself listening through the wall sometimes, which I felt guilty about, though not enough to stop. The hums, the clacks, the faint dragging sound, they had a rhythm now. It was like his apartment came alive at night. My co-workers started to notice I looked tired. I told them it was just the new place, the adjustment period. That wasn't a lie, exactly. My nights were all about listening for that soft, inevitable click of his door at 3 a.m. Once, I thought about asking him directly. Something casual, hey, you work nights, or, where do you head off to so early? But every time I saw him in daylight, his calm politeness disarmed me. He had a way of smiling that closed off further questions, like he'd learned exactly how to end a conversation without being rude. Then came the night the smell was strongest. I woke up around 3:15, the air thick with that metallic tang. It was stronger than before, seeping through the crack under my door. I thought about calling maintenance, maybe there was a gas leak or something chemical in the pipes. But then I heard it again, the steady scrape of metal on metal, faint but unmistakable, coming from the other side of the wall. It lasted less than a minute, then silence. The next morning, everything was normal again. Evan was gone, presumably at work or wherever he spent his days. But there was something new taped to his door, a plain white envelope, unmarked, sealed. When I left for work later that morning, it was gone. That was when I realized I had stopped feeling curious and started feeling watched. The night I decided to follow him, I told myself it was just to ease my own mind. Curiosity had turned into a kind of low-grade anxiety that no amount of sleep or distraction could fix. Every evening I'd hear those same subtle cues, the faint shuffle of movement, the careful lock turning, the soft thud of his shoes on the hallway floor. It had become impossible not to notice. That night, I left my apartment light off and waited in the dark. The clock on the microwave flicked from 2:59 to 3 o'clock, and like clockwork, his door opened. I heard the same soft metallic clink, maybe keys, maybe something else. Through the peephole, I saw him dressed in his usual dark clothes, duffel bag slung over his shoulder. His posture was straight, movements measured. He checked the hall, then walked toward the stairwell. I gave him a head start before slipping out, pulling my jacket tight. The stairwell was cold, the kind of draft that carries the smell of concrete and dust. I followed at a distance, my heart beat louder than my footsteps. The building door clicked softly behind him, and I stepped out into the night just in time to see him crossing the street under a street lamp's dull glow. The city was quiet in that eerie in-between hour, too late for night owls, too early for commuters. I kept to the opposite side of the road as he walked, not quickly but with purpose, cutting through narrow blocks toward the park a few streets over. He didn't look around once. The park was nearly empty except for a row of lampposts that only half worked. Evan veered off the main path and disappeared into a grove of trees near the old bandstand. I hesitated before following, not because I was afraid of him exactly, but because I wasn't sure what I'd do if he caught me. Still, curiosity had me by the collar. I moved slowly along the path, staying close to the shadows. My eyes adjusted enough to catch glimpses between the trees, his silhouette kneeling near one of the benches, that duffel bag open beside him. I couldn't make out much, but I heard a faint metallic scrape and the sound of something being set down. Then came a soft thump, like earth being shifted or a bag dropped onto dirt. After a few minutes, he stood, zipped the duffel, and looked around. My heart stopped. For a moment I thought he was staring right at me, but he only scanned the path briefly before heading back toward the street. I crouched behind a tree and waited until his footsteps faded before moving closer. In the patch of dim light under the nearest lamppost, I saw disturbed ground near the bench, a rough patch of dirt that looked freshly tamped down. I couldn't tell what he'd left there, and I wasn't brave enough to find out. The air smelled faintly of that same metallic tang from the hallway, mixed with damp earth. I hurried home before he could return. By the time I got back to my apartment, the adrenaline had worn off, leaving a strange hollowness behind. I lay awake until dawn, wondering if I'd crossed some invisible line. The next morning, I woke to police cars outside the building. 2 cruisers were parked by the curb, lights off but presence unmistakable. When I went down to check the mail, I overheard a few neighbors talking by the lobby doors, something about officers in the park earlier that morning. They'd found something, though no one seemed to know what. I asked one of them, a woman from 4C, what she'd heard. She shrugged and said the police had cordoned off a section near the bandstand. Could be a lost pet or something, she said, though her tone didn't sound convinced. When I passed by Evan's door later that afternoon, there was no sign of him. No faint noise from inside, no scent, nothing. I tried not to read into it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever the police had found, it wasn't a coincidence. By evening, the news mentioned an ongoing investigation in the park, but no details. No name, no photo, no follow-up. Just a passing story in the background of a local broadcast. I thought about telling someone what I'd seen, about the duffel bag, the fresh dirt, the sound of scraping metal. But I couldn't imagine explaining it without sounding like a conspiracy theorist or a nosy neighbor with too much imagination. That night, I barely slept. Every creak in the hallway made me sit up and listen. The next time I saw Evan would be 2 days later, calm, polite, and carrying groceries as if nothing had changed. But when he looked at me that time, I could swear he knew I'd been there. For a few days, things settled into a strained kind of normal. Evan went back to his quiet routines, morning coffee, afternoon walks, the occasional polite nod in the hallway. But the rhythm had changed. His movements seemed slower, his tone flatter, as if some unseen tension had tightened behind his calm exterior. The police were gone from the park, though yellow tape still fluttered from the benches near the bandstand. The local news stopped mentioning it altogether, as if the story had been quietly buried. But in our building, the silence around it felt heavier than ever. I tried not to cross paths with him, but that was nearly impossible in a place with one narrow hallway and a shared laundry room. Every time we ran into each other, I caught myself studying him too closely, watching for signs that he knew I'd followed him. One evening, as I was sorting mail in the lobby, he appeared beside me so suddenly I almost dropped the envelopes. He smiled in that same polite, distant way and said something about how quiet the building had become lately. His voice carried a mild amusement, but his eyes didn't. Then he said, almost as an afterthought, "You ever notice how some people don't sleep much around here?" I froze. The way he said it wasn't accusatory, but it wasn't casual either. It was the kind of comment that felt like a test. I managed a weak laugh and mumbled something about bad insulation and thin walls. He smiled again, too easily, and nodded. After that, I started locking my door twice. It wasn't paranoia, not exactly. Just a growing unease that I couldn't reason away. Every sound in the hallway felt personal, every footstep deliberate. Even when nothing happened, I found myself waiting for it, the creak, the knock, the sound of his door at 3 a.m. And then came the night he didn't leave. I stayed up, listening for that familiar click, the faint rhythm of his shoes on the floor. But the hallway remained silent. The clock passed 3, then 4, then dawn. For the first time since I'd moved in, I woke to sunlight without having heard him go out. That day, when I stepped out to grab coffee, his door opened as I passed. He stood there, hair slightly disheveled, eyes bloodshot as if he hadn't slept. He greeted me politely but didn't step aside. "Strange hours lately," he said softly. "You keep them too, don't you?" There was no obvious threat in his tone, but something in the phrasing made my chest tighten. I tried to sound casual, said I'd been having insomnia. He nodded slowly, like he already knew that. Then he added, "Trust is a fragile thing in close quarters. You ever noticed that?" Before I could respond, he gave a faint, courteous smile and closed his door. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the wood grain of the door, trying to figure out if he'd just warned me or confided in me. Over the next few days, I tried to ignore him entirely. I left for work early, came home late, avoided the hallway when I heard movement. But his presence lingered, subtle, patient, unshakable. Once, I came home to find a folded note under my door. It was blank except for a single sentence written neatly in blue ink: "Curiosity is good until it's seen as surveillance." No name. No signature. I didn't know what to do with it. Part of me wanted to confront him outright, to ask what he thought I'd done. Another part of me, the part that had seen him in the park with that duffel bag, told me to leave it alone. That night, I heard movement again, but this time it wasn't his door opening. It was a faint sound from the hallway, right outside mine, like someone standing still just beyond the threshold. I didn't move. I just sat in the dark and listened. After a while, the footsteps faded. The next morning, his door was slightly ajar again. I considered knocking, maybe just to clear the air, but before I could, I saw his reflection in the peephole, standing there, perfectly still, as if listening to my hesitation. Then, slowly, his door closed. It wasn't a confrontation in the usual sense. No shouting, no accusations. But it felt like a silent acknowledgement that both of us knew something about the other we weren't supposed to. And whatever balance we'd had before was gone. It happened by accident, the kind of accident that only happens when you're trying too hard not to think about something. I'd spent the past week keeping my distance, convincing myself that the strange tension between us would fade if I just left it alone. But curiosity doesn't really disappear, it just hides until opportunity knocks. Or in my case, until a maintenance mishap forced my hand. One morning, I came home early from work to find a small flood creeping out from under Evan's door, a thin stream of water pooling into the hallway. I knocked, called his name, waited. Nothing. The sound of running water echoed faintly from inside. I thought about leaving it for the building manager, but the carpet was already soaking through, and I didn't want the mess spreading into my place. The lock was one of those old-fashioned latches that could be jimmied with a flathead screwdriver, which I happened to have in my pocket from fixing a cabinet earlier that week. I hesitated for a moment, then told myself it was a practical favor, not snooping. With one careful twist, the door opened. The first thing that hit me was the smell, that same faint metallic tang, but heavier now, mixing with damp air. A bathroom faucet hissed somewhere in the back, water spilling over a sink. I moved through the apartment quickly, turning it off. The place was spotless but strange, minimal furniture, bare walls, everything arranged with exact precision. Then I saw the typewriters. 3 of them, lined up neatly on a long table against the far wall. Old, heavy models from different decades, all meticulously cleaned. Beside them were stacks of paper, some typed, some covered in notes and symbols I didn't recognize. A corkboard above the desk was filled with clipped newspaper headlines, some yellowed with age. I stepped closer, scanning the articles. Most were about political corruption, whistleblowers, and vanished journalists. Some had names circled, dates underlined, notes scribbled in neat blue handwriting. One headline caught my eye: investigative reporter disappears after expose on city contracts. The photo beneath it was blurry but unmistakably him, Evan, younger, with shorter hair and that same serious expression. The article dated back nearly 6 years. It started to make sense, piece by piece. The late-night trips, the packages, the secrecy. The sound of typing. He wasn't hiding something criminal, he was hiding from something. I sat down in the desk chair, my mind spinning. The duffel bag, the park, the police. Maybe he'd been burying documents or hard drives. Maybe that night, whatever he left there was a clue or backup. I didn't hear him come in. The sound of the door closing behind me snapped everything into focus. I turned, heart pounding. He stood in the doorway, not angry exactly, more disappointed, like he'd been expecting this. He didn't say much. Just looked at me for a long moment, then stepped past and turned off the lamp near the desk. His movements were calm, deliberate. "You shouldn't be here," he said finally, voice low but even. "It's safer if you don't know." I started to stammer out an apology, but he raised a hand slightly, not to threaten, just to stop me. Then he added, "You think I'm dangerous. I'm not. But the people who read those papers were." He gestured to the corkboard, then to the window blinds, still drawn tight. "They don't forget," he said quietly. "And they don't forgive." I didn't know what to say. The metallic smell made sense now: ink, typewriter oil, not blood or anything sinister. The packages were likely documents, information changing hands through private channels. The late-night trips. Maybe meetings. Maybe drops. He looked at me one last time and said, "If anyone comes asking, you've never met me." Then, as calmly as if ending a conversation about the weather, he opened the door and left. I stood there for a while, staring at the walls, the typewriters, the fragments of a life spent half hidden. The realization that I'd misjudged him wasn't comforting, it was terrifying in a different way. Because if he was telling the truth, then whoever he was hiding from might not be far behind. When I finally locked his door and stepped back into the hallway, I felt the weight of it settle in, the knowledge I wasn't supposed to have. The apartment across from mine no longer belonged to a quiet neighbor with strange habits. It belonged to someone who lived on borrowed time. And now, I was part of that story too. After that day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, not by Evan, but by someone else. It started subtly. A car parked across the street with 2 men inside, engine idling longer than seemed reasonable. A click on my phone line that hadn't been there before. An unfamiliar envelope slipped into my mailbox and then gone by the time I reached for it, as if it had been placed by mistake, or removed deliberately. At first, I told myself it was coincidence. City life was full of background noise, and people came and went constantly. But after seeing those men in the black sedan for the 3rd night in a row, always the same car, always the same spot, I couldn't pretend anymore. Evan didn't come home for 2 days. His blinds stayed closed, no sounds from inside, no faint smell of metal or typewriter ink. The absence itself was unnerving. It felt like he'd simply vanished again, as if he'd slipped underground the way he apparently had years before. That weekend, the building felt emptier than usual. Even the elevator seemed quieter, its hum swallowed by something heavier in the air. I caught myself glancing through my peephole more often, half expecting to see him, half dreading who else might appear. On Sunday night, I finally saw him again, not in the hallway, but outside, near the alley where we'd first crossed paths in the dark. He was speaking with someone in a grey overcoat. Their voices were low, hurried, and the exchange lasted less than a minute. Then the stranger walked off toward the sedan parked down the street. Evan watched him go, face unreadable. I nearly called out, but something in his posture made me stop. He looked more tired than I'd ever seen him, shoulders hunched, eyes darting toward the building windows as if counting who might be watching. The next morning, a note was slid under my door. Just one sentence again, don't talk to anyone about what you saw. No signature, no explanation, but I knew who it was from. By afternoon, the car outside was gone. In its place, an unfamiliar van idled near the corner for an hour, then disappeared. My nerves were frayed. I caught myself checking the locks over and over, staring at the blinds to make sure no silhouettes moved behind them. Around dusk, there was a soft knock at my door, 2 taps, a pause, then one more. I didn't answer right away. When I finally did, Evan stood there, pale and drawn, holding a thin envelope. He looked over his shoulder once before speaking. I don't have much time, he said quietly. They're getting closer. I didn't ask who they were. I didn't need to. He handed me the envelope. If something happens to me, keep this safe. Don't open it yet. You'll know when you should. I started to ask where he was going, but he cut me off with a tired shake of his head. You shouldn't have to choose, he murmured. But you will. Then he turned and walked down the hall without another word. The elevator doors closed behind him, and that was the last time I saw him alive, or at least, the last time I saw him at all. That night, the sedan returned. I watched from the peephole as 2 men in dark coats walked up the stairs, stopped outside his apartment, and knocked. When no one answered, they tried the handle. Locked. One of them glanced toward my door, not long, just a flicker, but long enough to make my breath catch. They didn't stay long. A few minutes later, I heard them descend the stairs again, their footsteps fading into the hum of the city night. After they left, I found myself sitting on the floor beside my door, the envelope still sealed on the table. I wanted to open it, to understand what I'd been pulled into, but I couldn't bring myself to. If I knew too much, I'd be part of it, really part of it. For the rest of the night, I sat there listening, waiting for any sound from across the hall. None came. The next morning, his apartment was wide open. Empty. Clean. Not a single trace of the typewriters, the papers, the files, everything gone, as if he'd never lived there at all. Even the smell was gone. Only one thing remained, a single typewriter key, resting in the middle of the floor. The letter E. I picked it up, turning it over in my palm. Cold metal, perfectly ordinary, yet somehow final. When I got back to my apartment, the black sedan had returned to the curb. The driver's window rolled down slightly as I passed. A man inside glanced at me, then looked away. That was when I realized it wasn't just Evan who'd been running. Now, it might be my turn. For days after Evan vanished, the building felt hollow. His door stayed slightly open, as if waiting for him to return. No one from management came to clear the unit. No movers, no police, no official notice of vacancy. Just an empty doorway that made me feel like I was living across from a ghost. The black sedan disappeared, too, but not immediately. It lingered for 3 more nights, parked half a block away with its engine off. Sometimes I'd catch a faint reflection from binocular lenses or the flicker of a phone screen in the dark. By the 4th morning, the space was empty. The quiet that followed wasn't peaceful, it was watchful, like the city was holding its breath. I kept the envelope where Evan had left it, tucked inside a drawer beneath a stack of old bills. Every so often I'd open the drawer just to see it sitting there, untouched. I didn't need to open it to feel the weight of it. It was the kind of object that changed the room around it just by existing. A week passed, and I started to wonder if the whole thing had been exaggerated by my own imagination, if Evan had simply left town, tired of hiding, starting fresh somewhere else. But then, one Thursday morning, I found a plain brown envelope in my mailbox. No return address. No postmark. Just my name, written in that same neat blue ink. Inside was a folded note and a small flash drive. The note said only, "Thank you for listening, even when you didn't understand. You were right to be curious. Everything that mattered is here. Do what you think is right. E." That was it. No explanation. No warning. Just that small USB drive, black and unmarked, like a seed that could grow into something uncontrollable if planted in the wrong soil. I didn't plug it in. Not that day. Not the next. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment, maybe when I felt braver, or more certain. But certainty never came. What I did do was search his name again, the one from those old articles. It took effort, digging through paywalled archives and half-deleted web pages, but I found more pieces. He'd exposed a chain of corruption that reached into city contracts, private developers, even law enforcement. The trail went cold right after the final piece was published, the one that had named names. Reading those fragments made something in my stomach turn. If that flash drive held what I thought it did, then Evan hadn't just been hiding. He'd been protecting something, maybe himself, maybe the truth. Maybe both. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, the flash drive resting beside it. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the apartment. My finger hovered over the USB port for a long time. It wasn't just fear of what I might find. It was the weight of the choice itself. If I turned it in, to the police, a journalist, anyone, I'd be stepping into the same shadows that swallowed him. If I ignored it, if I buried it or destroyed it, I'd be letting his work die with him. The clock ticked past midnight. Somewhere down the street, a siren wailed and faded. I thought of Evan's calm voice, the quiet way he'd said, "You shouldn't have to choose. But you will." He'd been right about that. I stared at the flash drive for what felt like hours. In the end, I placed it back inside the envelope, sealed it again, and tucked it into a drawer I rarely used. Maybe one day I'd open it. Maybe I wouldn't. For now, silence felt safer than truth. Still, I can't unhear that sound, the soft click of his door opening at 3 a.m. Like a metronome marking time for something bigger than either of us. Some nights, when I can't sleep, I find myself listening for it again. And though I know his apartment is empty, I swear I can still hear it, that quiet, careful sound of someone leaving to do what needs to be done, no matter the cost. Maybe that's what truth sounds like when it moves through the dark. And maybe one night, when I finally decide to plug in that drive, I'll find out.